Let's begin this newscast with a news alert coming in from France. A stabbing incident has taken place at the Notre Dame Church in Nice. In France, at least 3 people have been reported dead, including one woman who has been beheaded. Several others are injured. Nice Mayor Christian Estrosi has said that the suspect behind the attack has been arrested. Estrosi said it appeared that the incident had been a terrorist attack on the city's Basilica of Notre Dame. The terror probe has been opened in France. It's also being said the mayor of the French city of Nice has just announced, saying that the suspect kept mentioning the phrase Allahu Akbar. For more details, let's quickly go across to our correspondent Mandy Clark, who's joining us live from London to bring us more details. Mandy, what are you picking from ground zero as of now? What are the reactions? The mayor has just announced that the suspect was heard chanting Allahu Akbar. Does that also indicate the identity of the attacker?
Not necessarily identity, but perhaps the motive. What we know is this is obviously hot in the heels after the beheading of the teacher in Paris because he showed those cartoons that is deemed offensive in the Islamic religion. Allahu Akbar obviously means God is great. So it seems that he might have felt that this was his religious duty, that it was an Islamic terrorist attack. That sounds like the hallmarks of it. We also are hearing that one of the victims was beheaded in or near Notre Dame Basilica. Now, this is a church, so again, that there is a religious connotation to this attack, that it was, don't know much about the attacker, who the attacker was, or even the gender of the attacker. That's being kept under wraps at the minute, but it does have those hallmarks of the terrorist attack. And of course, Nice is no stranger to terrible incidents. It was a few years ago when a truck was used to run over people near Bastille Day. So this is a city that has known tragedy and has known terror. And unfortunately, it looks like this morning they're facing that again.
Right, Mandy, since you mentioned that this is a city which has known tragedy, of course, this is the 4th attack in recent memory where the French administration has been found wanting. The administration realized it only after the attack happened earlier. Do you see that there's also been a security lapse, because now we are seeing radicalized individuals coming from within the country? They are not foreign terrorists.
Certainly in the past, we have seen that these were not foreigners that were coming in, that it happened with French citizens. Of course, we don't know the nationality of this attacker, but certainly it does have that similar hallmarks. The problem we are seeing repeatedly in a lot of the terror attacks that France has experienced is they're often operating as lone wolves. These are not complex attacks that have been planned for months, that are allow the security forces to essentially disrupt and prevent these attacks. These seem to be lone wolf attacks that get radicalized online and then use their own motives and to work alone. And those are far more difficult for the security forces to find, because ultimately they have to find just one person who are planning these awful attacks.
Right.
So it is.
What do you make in terms of the magnitude of this current attack, since France in general is already on a security alert, given the kind of threats that have been sounded post the Charlie Hebdo incident? What do you have to say?
French security forces seem to be stretched to the maximum. They've been on a high security alert, not just since the attack, but for years, because of repeated attacks throughout their country. So it has just put France in even further back, but they need a better security plan, because these attacks are so individual specific and happen so quickly and have such a high degree of horror. Beheadings are, they grab international headlines, which is ultimately good for the terror group because their cause reaches the wider audience. But it is terrible for the French forces and security forces, because it just means killing a few people will grab international headlines and create a feeling of that the security forces are out of control and cannot control the terror attacks that are happening within their own borders.
Absolutely. Also, Mandy, for our viewers here in India, could you please explain this location where the attack has taken place in Nice? Is it known for any sort of radical elements?
Well, there has been a number of attacks in Nice. Nice itself is not known for having radical elements, but we have seen a number of terror attacks, and there are pockets of disenfranchised, and a lot of the attackers have been coming from disenfranchised locations. Now, again, we don't know who this attacker is or his or her background, but we do know in the past that these pockets that feel dislocated, unconnected to the French population, that are largely immigrant or refugee populations, this is where we have seen a number of attacks. Nice certainly has that. It's interesting, the location of the attack where it happened was in or near the Notre Dame Basilica. This is an iconic location. It's a religious location. So that was clearly a reason why the attacker chose that location.
Also, Mandy, attacks after attacks have been happening. The threats are very much in public domain, and yet why hasn't France been able to crack down and prevent such attacks? This is also applicable to the UK, since even London has been privy to several knife attacks.
It is the prevalence we've seen of the radicalization online. So before, when more traditionally, when the terror attacks happened, there was a network of terrorists. They would often have to meet up. They would communicate more frequently. Now, a lot of radicalization happens passively, that people watch videos that inspire them, and they don't necessarily engage on social media to say that they're about to do this attack. They just go ahead and do it. And those quiet terrorists are incredibly difficult for those security forces to crack down on. So really, they'll have to look at the root causes, which is where they find these radicalized materials so easily online. Right. That looks like the best step.
Right. As we speak, there's more information pouring in. For that, I'm quickly going to go across to Cole Stangler, who's joining us from France live at this hour. Cole is a journalist. On that note, also a big thank you to Mandy for bringing us all those latest details. Cole, what's the latest that you're picking on this attack?
Well, we know at the moment, Reuters has reported that there are 3 people that are dead. There are several people that are injured. We know that the mayor of Nice is calling this a terrorist attack. We also know that according to Reuters, one of the victims was beheaded, which is very alarming as well. If you think back to what happened just a couple of weeks ago here in France with the attack against Samuel Paty, the middle school teacher. So we know that the president is having a crisis meeting. Has actually just begun now, but I think we're still waiting to know more information critically about the attacker.
Cole, is there any indication to establish that this is an attack as far as Islamic terrorism is concerned? Because the mayor in Nice has just announced that the suspect was heard continuously chanting Allahu Akbar.
I hadn't seen that latest from the mayor. I think we need to wait for the information to come in, but I think it is important to what we have right now are a certain number of elements to kind of put this in context. And if you look at the site of the attack outside this church in Nice, a Catholic church. If you think about we know that reports say that someone was beheaded. We now have, as you mentioned, the mayor of Nice saying that. So signs would certainly point in that direction.
Absolutely. Also, Cole, attacks after attacks have been happening in France. The threats are very much in public domain, and yet why isn't France able to crack down and prevent such attacks?
It's a very good question. I think it's a question that people are asking themselves this morning. As maybe your viewers were hearing, we had just recently in France, the country's still reeling in many respects from this attack against Samuel Paty, a middle school teacher who was beheaded. We also saw earlier last month, in September, we saw an attack outside the offices of Charlie Hebdo, and we've seen attacks, of course, prior to this in Nice. Back in 2016, there was a major terrorist attack around the national holiday, July 14th, in which more than 80 people were killed. So I think we have to wait to find more information about the suspects here before we jump to any conclusions. But certainly there is frustration there is frustration about this. It's also worth pointing out that in response to the Samuel Paty attack, again, just a couple of weeks ago, the government is already in the process of taking a number of measures.
Since you mentioned Samuel Paty, France is no longer dealing with organized jihadist networks but isolated individuals who have been radicalized. How should now France shift gears in terms of surveillance?
I think that's a good question to ask to surveillance experts. I think the internet obviously is playing a critical role, and I think it's a question that a lot of the authorities are asking themselves. But I think it also is worth pointing out that the government, in response to this, the Paty attack, has been trying to take a number of measures. In response, we've seen the government moving to dissolve two important associations, NGOs in France. On the one hand, the Collective Against Islamophobia, which the government, according to the government, says is contributing to this climate, and then also the NGO Baraka City as well, and it's also closing a mosque in Pantin, a suburb of Paris. The government is taking fairly aggressive measures here, and the likes of which we haven't really seen in the last couple of years, actually.
Right, and before I close our conversation, Cole, I'm going to just touch upon the international dimensions. There have been protests in Libya, Bangladesh, and even the Gaza Strip, along with calls for a boycott of French products and a growing war of words with Turkey and its president. How do you view the international unease over the entire issue of Islamic separatism that has been raised by President Macron?
Yeah, of course, that's the other really important element of this is happening in this backdrop that you mentioned. We've seen the war of words escalate with the Turkish President Erdogan, who was also depicted just yesterday, actually, in Charlie Hebdo. He did not like the way that he was depicted, and the government criticized that as well. I think it's also important to point out here that we've seen some calls for a boycott of French products. According to what I've seen, and according to most reports, those boycott calls are still fairly limited, and they're also, and this is very important to stress, at odds with what the majority of Muslims in France think. France, of course, has the largest, or one of the largest populations of Muslims in Europe. At least millions of Muslims living in France, and I don't think that there's I think it's important to draw that distinction between what we're seeing in the world outside of France, the Muslim world outside of France. In some countries, these limited calls for a boycott, and then of course how Muslims in France are reacting, and of course the nation in general. The overwhelming response to the beheading of Samuel Paty, the middle school teacher, has been one of denunciation and criticism of what's been happening among French Muslims.
Absolutely, indeed, a very, very grim situation for a peace-loving country like France. Thank you so much, Cole Stangler, for bringing us all those details and joining our broadcast today.